it'd be very interesting, I think, for the audience to hear your experiences of the regulatory environment within Europe, and also the clinical trial experience, because clearly what we've also seen in the area recently is an increase in the number of clinical studies and approvals in Europe.
Yep. And that's a good one for me to answer. So with Zynteglo, we were able to actually come to market through the adaptive pathways process, which is a great way for us to demonstrate the results that we had in our clinical trials, but then also commit to ongoing evidence through the real world evidence program. So that turned out to be great. In fact, we were approved in Europe before we were approved in the US. So in Europe, things are moving quite well. And also for Zynteglo specifically, there's more patients in Italy, for example, than there are in the entire United States. So that makes for transfusion-dependent thalassemia. So that makes a lot of sense. We do see the increasing need to ensure there is for future programs to ensure that people will be interested in paying for the long-term value of these things. This is something we can talk about later, but to ensure that the therapies are going to, they can look at the lifetime value of these therapies, and we can find a way to go forward. That's something that we, as an internal company, when you have limited resources and you're trying to figure out what sites and where to put things, that is something that does come up, and which sites do you want to have going. So that's something we can talk about later. Things are going quite well. In fact, we're ahead with Zynteglo than we are in the US, in Europe.
Great, thank you. And that brings us actually very nicely to the next topic, and probably one of the hottest topics for Europe, which is around HTA approvals, reimbursement and access. So Robin, can I ask you, we've heard that regulatory approvals have been very fast in Europe. The regulatory environment's been very supportive. But then it comes to the next step, which is the national HTA approvals and reimbursements. Could you give us some of your impressions of your experience there?
Yeah, sure, Chris. And for Libmeldi, we're actually in the middle of it. So we see some positive trends. On the one hand, there is enthusiasm and recognition for the need to collaborate cross-border. You know, the expertise of assessing ATMPs is rare. If you compare that with the rarity of the indication, you know, there's only very few people that can assess these products. So the willingness to work together across border really helps to get to a conclusion faster and a better decision. There's also a recognition that it's not a one-size-fits-all, and that especially for these very rare diseases and highly technical treatments, you probably need to be looking at things slightly differently. And we see initiatives that we're looking to engage with, like Benelux or Finos, where different countries come together to pool their expertise and hopefully allow for a quicker path to an HTA assessment. We also see a positive trend around recognizing patient rights to access in the different countries. We have the S2 Social Security process, the Crossborder directive. We have the national contact points, and all of these things are very positive. In addition, we see also, but this is very early for us still, a willingness to really think through innovative contracting. So that's all on the positive side. In practice, our experience is that on the ground, the experience can be mixed. There are hurdles to overcome. Gene therapy is disruptive for many of the health systems that we work with, and we see that sometimes the legislative framework can be vague. It's not always clear, where decisions are taken, and so a lot of work still has to be done there. But at the end of it, there is this willingness, and I think an acceptance that things will have to change with the arrival of these new technologies. So a lot of work to do, and a lot of stakeholders to engage with.
Thank you. And certainly we started to see an increased uptake in the area of CAR-T as well, which is, as I mentioned a little bit earlier in the life cycle, or later, earlier to market. So Emanuele, maybe you can give us some of the insights to what has been happening in that space and what it tells us about the future outlook for Europe.
Sure. Thanks, Chris. I would want to add a comment to Robin's point earlier as well around the need for payers to also rethink their approaches to gene therapies and cell therapies when sometimes intention to treat analyses are not exactly correct based on how collections are taking place. And that's something that we found in a handful of countries was a very difficult topic to bridge, and still is actually. I think in spite of those difficulties, what we see is that there is a really broad adoption in CAR T across Europe. And that I think is a result of all of the collaborative work that I mentioned earlier around preparation and ensuring quality and safety for patients across the board. We find that from a pure patient number perspective, we think we're just scratching the surface actually, because the biggest learning we're having right now is that when we look at the trial population and the labels for these therapies, the reality is that the patients that are coming to CAR T right now are still very, very late stage. And long term, that actually impacts the outcomes patients are going to have and the value that is going to be delivered. Not because there's nothing wrong with the therapies themselves, but if they're being used very late, it's simply not as big of an opportunity for patients themselves. So I think as we move forward, it's really important that we aim these therapies at the lines for which they were approved. And I realized that they were initially heralded as miracle ointments. They're not. They're fantastic therapies for third-line patients. I'm talking about the CAR T ones. So let's focus the community on treating that population, not a population that unfortunately loses more and more hope the more cycles of chemo or other treatments they go under. So that's really important. And that's something that I think we all need to be looking at, working with ministries, with patient groups, with professional societies to ensure that that happens. Because if that happens, the impact is going to be much broader, not just by number of patients, but the actual outcomes those patients are going to have.
I agree. I think we all really want access for as many patients as possible, and obviously that's in the interests of the patients. And I think innovative treatments will actually require that we have innovative solutions to the hurdles that there are to market access. So let me ask you, Doug, I know you've been considering novel reimbursement and payment schemes. How far do you think we've progressed in Europe on such matters?
Just to kind of reiterate what was said, I think there's a lot of good talk going on, but I think when you're actually in the room, there are some challenges, but I think we're making good progress. I think the first bit, like in most markets, there is an HTA assessment where they look at the value that you bring. And for us, the first step through that is to make sure people are considering that lifetime of value. And that's the part that's the most challenging thing to give. If you have a one-time treatment, how are they considering the benefits 20 or 30 years from now? Certainly they might need to be discounted, but they can't be completely forgotten. So our first step in there is trying to get people to believe that bit. And whether it's a, if you're going to look at a cost effectiveness market and you're looking at the right modeling extrapolations for that, or some other means by which you can assess that long-term value needs to be in the initial assessment, or else you really can't be in a good position in your negotiation framework because you've lost a lot of the value of your therapy up front. So we've seen some advances there, but I think we can continue to get better at that bit. We have seen some openings to new reimbursement models. I think both Rob and Emanuele have been through these different negotiations. You can see as you get through them, different things work in different markets. We had put a 5 payment model up front as our initial entry, just so we can have some of these conversations in a level of detail that we needed to have them. And we got some advances on that. And the neat thing we found on the other side is that, the payers have their own ideas of how they want to do it, and we can adapt those. So I've seen some good advances there. I think there's more work to be done. It's not just in the payment model itself, like
there's anything from the data collection, it seems to be a very logical thing for us to think about. But even if it's an accounting mechanism that you would really consider making a commitment for a one-time treatment, is that going to be an accounting consideration they're going to need to make for a long time?
So that's a thing that's hidden behind the scenes. That those things are considered in, but I think there's also things like, you know, what works for a particular country and whether they care or they not consider a one-time or a payment very specific to very unique set of some payers. And I did want to tee up on something Robin said, which is really important for us as a smaller company, was doing those joint assessments. I think understanding how those joint assessments work, there's that you can get to a broader patient populations through a limited number of assessments. And that's something that really helps if you can't be in every country you want to be in. Because I think we all want to be as many countries as you possibly could, but sometimes there's limitations to that. Those joint assessments do offer up a nice way for us to have a broad review of our product and then have local negotiations on the price as much as possible.
So there's certainly, I think we're hearing a willingness to actually engage. There's certainly a desire to actually come up with novel payment mechanisms. I think there's probably an element that sometimes the actual fiscal rules, for example, the ability to carry over accrue liabilities in countries and other things, may not support these systems. But let me ask each of you, because I know this is one of the topics that has been most concerning to many people who are seeking to come to Europe to actually launch products here. What would you think would be the biggest help to you and to gain access to patients in terms of either HTA or pricing approaches? So maybe start with Robin, and then I'll give each of you an opportunity to answer this question.
So yeah, just thinking about the topics that we already covered, right? The engaging with the institutions that do the health technology assessment, seeking out opportunities to work across different countries. We already mentioned initiatives like FINOS, like Beneluxa. I think engaging early, also with the regulator. I think those are some of the obvious tips. On the access side, I think it is trying to make that connection with the long-term value and potentially tying reimbursement to those longer-term outcomes to address the inherent uncertainty, and especially for us in rare diseases. By nature, the data set is going to be limited, and to alleviate some of that, think through payment by result or payment at result type schemes to take away some of that uncertainty.
Emanuele, do you want to add something?
Maybe I would just put an even finer point on your point, Robin, of spending time, for lack of a better word, educating, but at least sharing the needs and the challenges of each therapy and how they can be solved together, right? So sometimes we all make the mistake of jumping in and going straight to the dossier. Well, there's no point in discussing the dossier if it's not clear why it's one time, why it must be administered in few centers, why it needs a very specified way of managing patient ID and chain of identity, right? All those things that then result in what happens on the ground with physicians and patients. And we found that wherever we have the time to have those conversations, things then went much more smoothly and quickly. But wherever, because of circumstances, those conversations couldn't take place, there were far more misunderstandings, far more issues, and far more delays, ultimately, of patients getting the therapy.
And Doug.
Yeah, I think things have been well said. I think one thing I might want to add is there is a unique thing where you're considering maybe offsetting a number of direct medical costs that are easy to quantify. So if you're offsetting relieving someone from having a chronic therapy over time, that's a little bit easier for payers to quantify versus something like one of our therapies tends to offset things that are less costly but have a tremendous impact on patient quality of life and caregiver burden. And those are obviously harder to capture depending on what system you're talking about. It's easier or harder, but those are the kinds of things where you really need that support, like Emanuele was just talking about, is the, get the patient and physician support, talking about the needs for these therapies to be one time to relieve all the things that are going on. Other than that, it does get to be market specific about things like, like 1.5% discount rate in the UK is something that we're really focused on, and a number of people are focused on, because if these are meant to have a lifetime benefit, then that's something that should be considered in the committee review. So those are the things that you need to think about.
Great, thank you. And this is a topic, as all four of us know, you could actually spend a whole day actually discussing as a panel in its own right. But I think the challenges aren't going to go away. The fact is that we have very novel life-saving drugs, so we will be bringing them to market with relatively limited data. Sometimes, by the way, not in the position where the product should be best used. I think many of us, particularly in oncology, also suffer with the fact that the appropriate place to do the studies first is end-stage patients, but that's not where, over the lifetime of the product, we're going to expect most of the benefits. So I think that the key, I think everyone is talking to here for HTA is engagement, understanding, expertise, and a real desire to value the products appropriately, collecting the best information and surrogates available. And certainly that's very country specific how they want to pay for the product, but that's also requires a great deal of knowledge and access to data to actually support those hypotheses as well. So I think that is something that we continue and will have to continue to work very closely with all of the authorities on. So I'm aware that was a hot topic, so we spent quite a lot of time on that, but I think it is important to everyone who's in this space, because ultimately we need to find solutions to make the products accessible so that patients can receive the full benefit. But if we turn to some other issues now, one of the things that obviously some of the companies in the room are engaged in is actually manufacturing. We're all actually engaged in having our products cross borders. So, given that Europe is a single market, but there are actually, elements of need for cross-country collaboration. Let me start with Emanuele. As a manufacturer, how easy is it to actually to deal with any cross-border issues and actually supply within Europe?
So I would say it took quite a bit of work initially to sort out all the kinks, but now the issue of transporting blood products out and into the Union, as well as in places like Switzerland and Israel, which happen to be in my territory, have been worked out. There could be benefit if we were to harmonize some of those standards, but they are surmountable problems. They just don't make it easy to put something in place. So the flow of materials is there and it's possible. We have also seen a relative ease of the flow of patients between countries, pre-COVID, of course. And that was in part because those end up becoming minister to ministry situations that have to be handled. And when it's few patients, they can be handled relatively easily. So in that respect, patients can move around the Union. There are specific forms for doing that. It's not always well understood by patients, and it is often misunderstood by hospitals, who often end up shouldering some of the costs in the case of misunderstandings or administrative delays and so on. But that's an area where some good regulation and policy across the Union could go a long way to make that even easier. because today it's still done in a very one-off way.
Great. And you nicely alluded to the fact that, you know, one of the things about free movement of people is that it might include actually moving to actually receive treatment. And that may actually pose some other challenges, given that countries actually have national payment schemes for products. So Robin, let me ask you a question there. You know, clearly we may not choose to actually, or may not be able to establish treatment delivery centers for some products in all countries. How good is Europe at kind of coping with the movement of people to centers?
Yeah, that's a great point, Chris, and we've seen that. Our first product in the market, Vann, actually, we only have one treatment center in Europe, so it required us to really, navigate all of these challenges of moving people for treatment to Milan, which I must say, in some countries works well. We've seen it work with countries like Germany, Turkey, Sweden. With others, there's a bit more challenges there. So when it comes to these cross-border topics, the movement of patients and their families, and the reimbursement challenges that come with it, I think it's a bit of a mixed bag. But we've consequently been able to find ways in more and more countries. So I'm very hopeful that on that side of the cross-border question, we're making good progress. There is another topic around cross-border cooperation. We talked about HTA, of course, and policy, but very close to my heart is also the policy around newborn screening, and especially in rare diseases, newborn screening can hold the key to actually fully realize the potential of these treatments. So very important. And currently, we still have to engage in country pilots in every country in Europe almost. And it would be nice if there could be increased cross-border cooperation there, because although it is nice to do a pilot in Germany and a pilot in France and a pilot in Italy, something tells me that the Europeans aren't going to be so different that the outcome of those pilots will be drastically different. So if we could increase our cross-border collaboration there, I think it would really help patients in Europe and the advancements of this innovation.
Thank you. And Doug, from your experience as well, what would be the things that you think we could actually leverage with Europe, obviously being a mixture of countries, in terms of making cross-border collaboration an advantage rather than cross-borders being a hurdle?
And I would just agree with what has already been said. I think anytime I see something that goes smoothly, it's because of the quality of the team working on it, doing stuff very efficiently, and dealing with what I would call bottoms-up issues. And I think that they're dealing with one-off things, because those are where those issues arise. I think anything we can do to have more of a top-down approach, where there could be some smoothing out of this. And again, it's like everything else. These gene therapies, this is a new thing, so nobody's really come up with the principles that you need to fix these things. So we're dealing with a lot of one-off issues, and how can we think about a broadly applicable thing, whether it's transfer of supplies or patients. So in my old job, I spent quite a bit of time looking at cross-border healthcare, and how do you get patients between markets, because we're only going to be a limited number of places, and we worked on that for years. And I think the basics that were there, but there's a lot of interest in the so just getting to the idea that we're not going to be able to offer these treatments in all countries, and that we're going to need to find a way to get supplies and treatment patients moving around different treatment centers is set up. And I do think if you look at the cross-border healthcare stuff, there's some very, very good thinking there. It's just the mechanics don't work so well. And then how can we make those mechanics work better, especially in a case of a patient that needs therapy fast? So that's the other bit.
Great, thank you. And the other extreme, I think, Emanuele, is something that you and I are seeing in the CAR T cell space, which is, potentially the use of local exemptions, clinical trial exemptions, to actually potentially be used in order for local supply purposes. So maybe you'd like to give us maybe some thoughts on this and the potential pitfalls in such an approach.
Sure. So I would say a couple of things, Chris. First of all, we think that a geographically distributed network is key to ensure having good supply chain continuity and good access to the therapies globally. So from our perspective, we went from having everything based in the US to now having 2 manufacturing plants in Europe, 1 in Japan, 1 in Australia, and 1 we're working on in China. So that allows you to digest shocks to the system, whether they are COVID related or freight and transfer related. So that spreads the risk and frankly makes the logistics of reaching patients much better on a local level. So that's really important. As a result of that, what we're seeing is that there is no real issue or wait for patients to access CAR T therapies, in our case, globally. So as a result of that, I think the hospital exemption, for us, fills a very specific niche, which is a niche when there are no other therapies available for that specific patient, which is their original intended use. And in that case, we believe they make a lot of sense. I don't think anybody should get in the way of a physician doing all they can for a patient if there's nothing else that is approved and clinically proven to be advantageous. What is happening at the moment is that we're a bit at the edge of the line in terms of whether hospital exemption is being used properly or is being abused, if I may use a strong word. And initially, there were attempts to use it for indications for which there were already approved therapies, which was not their original intended use. So what is happening right now is that they are being used in indications for which there's nothing else, which makes perfect sense. But there's also some movement afoot to leverage those exemptions to further expand them into national approval and potentially EMEA approvals, which is not exactly what they were intended for, which also raises a few questions around the strength of the data packages that are going to be there and whether or not these therapies will actually be approvable by the EMA. And should they be found to be approved, will they be supplied across Europe? And then if not, then what does this say about the process that's being used? And are we all playing by the same rules or not? Because, if academic groups can use some things to go faster, well, then maybe we should all try to go faster as an industry. So those are some questions that are being floated up as a result of these activities, and they're not resolved, but they should be resolved in the interest of patients long term.
Okay. Thank you. Yeah. So, clearly a lot of, if you like, column inches, if I was a newspaper man, are being directed to the access issues in Europe. But equally important is that we ensure that patients can actually receive the delivery of the product in Europe. And I think all of us actually have very clear plans to make the products available broadly to all of those patients within the European sphere who will need them. Obviously, in some cases, that may make more sense to do it through a concentrated distribution pattern where people may need to cross borders in order to be at a center of excellence. And it may also be that we're also in a situation where what we're also trying to drive is a broader network of centers, as will be the case for CAR T. I think one of the things that I think we're all very keen to do is to support research, but also ensure that there is a consistent set of rules for products if they're used for commercial or broad commercial broad distribution in those areas where a marketing authorization exists for a product within Europe against a standard set of rules. So it's my pleasure to welcome Dick. You just joined us in the middle of very hot topics. Maybe to get you started, we'll actually give you a relatively easy question on the way in. You know, obviously, one of the things we did at the start of this meeting was we thought we'd establish a baseline with the experience today. So maybe you can just give us your first opinion of you know, your experience to date, and then we'll start looking towards the outlook for the future.
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot for the question. Yeah, I have a few reflections on that. The first one is it's been incredibly challenging. I must say this has been by far the most challenging endeavor I've done in the industry. I've been here for 20 years plus and run quite a lot of countries. It's been tough, and the reason for that is, of course, that the European systems were not really prepared for this kind of innovation. It's not really set up for dealing with CAR-Ts or very highly innovative treatments that is one-off and even potentially cure, or at least one-off. And that goes from legislation, it's regulatory frameworks, it's infrastructure not in place, there's payment restrictions, etc. So it's been challenging, but at the same time incredibly rewarding, fun, a great experience to be on this journey. And when we look at kind of the adoption in Europe, in CAR-Ts especially, versus the US, actually we've been doing as good as they have done. Of course we were able to learn quite a lot on how do you set up a center in terms of qualification, how do I ship cells across the world, etc., which was helpful. But in the end of the day, these two systems are actually quite different. So there were a lot that we had to do from scratch as well.
And so just to catch you up on the discussion, we've been discussing some of the main challenges that Europe may face, which are different from Europe. So, you know, again, to set the baseline, your baseline experience, where would you say that Europe is basically similar to the US, and where is it somewhat different?
Yeah, I think that what we sometimes underestimate is that US is also quite fractionated. We kind of think about it as one market and one country, but it's actually not. It's very fragmented in their payer system, etc. And yes, we have 20 different countries we need to go into with different payers, but they also face a lot more payers than that. So there are quite a lot of similarities in terms of complexity, etc. Actually the real challenges in the end are very different. Here I think it's a bit surprising that, you know, we on average we have a decent uptake, but it varies immensely between countries. So there are some which have a great uptake and better than the US, and there are some, even rich countries, who do not have access at all yet. So like always, it's this scattered European picture which we deal with.
So I'm going to ask the panelists, each of the panelists, two final questions. So I'll give you a bit of time to prepare. The first one is, you mentioned, and I won't give the country's name, but you have some countries, for example, have 9 out of 9 of the products reimbursed available. I think at the lower end, it's 2 out of 9 of the approved cell therapy products, cell and gene therapy products approved and available. If you could take examples from the best countries that are actually being able to license and make these products available. I'm going to, ask each of you, what would you consider to be the best examples and exportable examples that you think might be relevant for other countries to look at? So let's look at the very positive experiences we've had, and let's actually ask ourselves which countries would we give really congratulations in terms of doing a great job in order to make these products available to the UK, and what made them successful. So maybe Robin, I can start with you there. If you wanted to call out a really great experience within Europe that could be learned from, what would it be?
Yes, a great question, Dick. I think there are different dimensions to this question, right? If I think of the quick access, obviously the German system comes to mind, where you're able to have access very quickly with the pre-EMNOC period price. So definitely the other countries that provide some form of reimbursed early access, Italy, France come to mind. When we think of the way countries are willing to collaborate, countries like the Nordics, from the Finos countries come to mind, or the Benelux countries come to mind. And then, back to my favorite topic, newborn screening. There's countries that are much more progressive. Italy, for example, and lately also Germany, Netherlands, who are very, let's say, progressive in adopting newborn screening to their national panels. And again, for these gene therapies, that may be the key to fully realize the potential of this innovation.
Emanuele?
So I would say there's several, I would give several prizes by category. I would say that France, we see just amazing openness to new therapies and to making them available even pre-approval, which is unique. In a way that is friendly to both patients and manufacturers and balances both things. So really big marks to France on that. I would say our experience was that Spain, unlike usual Spanish reimbursement, which takes over a year, in most cases 18 months, we were able to have reimbursement in Spain in about 3 months post-approval, which was unheard of in Spain, because they embraced the concept of risk sharing. And similarly to Italy, which is also a long reimbursement country usually, risk sharing was embraced, and as a result, access was there faster than it would have been normally. And then, shout out to the UK for speed. I think we were approved there in under 4 weeks post EMA, which was also unheard of in many cases. So, yeah.
And Doug, would you like to add something?
I think it's all going to be mixed. I think some way for me is like figuring out a way to get, like I said before, the lifetime value. And I think, if you look at a long-term cost effectiveness approach, that makes sense, but there's so many hurdles in the way to make it work the right way that makes it a bit challenging. I will say France has been great to work with, and actually forward thinking in their adaptations of how they're thinking through stuff has been great. And we're still working through the processes. I don't have a ton of answers for you, but I think those have been going well. And then again, groups that are familiar, like Italy, taking risk share on board as a standard way of doing things, kind of have the forward thinking stuff in their minds about how you do that and the mechanisms by which you do that. I think we challenge people a little beyond the short-term thinking. So like for our therapies, we're thinking a very long-term. You can have a risk-sharing deal which is in the near term, but what does that mean for the very long term? And that's the part we have a little bit more challenges. But those who are willing to go at risk, define those outcomes that are very easy to measure and everybody can agree whether you hit that or not, and putting in a system that you can track it. Those are the main ones. But yeah, those are my few comments. No one's perfect. I think everybody's working through it, but those are the big points.
Yeah. And Dick, from your perspective, what have been good examples that you would call out?
Yeah, I don't think it's so surprising that my list is the same as Emanuele's. We face the same thing. So yeah, again, shout out for France. This ATU system that they have in place is just guaranteeing access for patients. And in terms of learnings, they're actually learning from themselves and revitalizing the system this spring. And it looks like it's going to be even better after that. So I think that is a real call out. And in addition to those things that Emanuele highlighted, I think some countries had a proper CAR-T plan, which I think is a big learning for the next generation of innovative products to come to, because they realized 2 years before this happened that there are a number of things in our system that is just not designed for CAR-T. We need to think about this. How many CAR-T centers are we going to have? Who's going to pay for apheresis? Who's going to pay for the hospitalizations? How are the referral mechanism going to look like? What are the demands we're going to put on the treatment centers, etc., etc., etc. They'd thought about all of that to start with, and as such, when we were able to negotiate reimbursement, both Emanuele's company and ours, they took off. While, like you said, Robin, the system in Germany is of course fantastic that you get early access, but actually they didn't have these views on what would be hurdles early on. So they were kind of more faced with, yeah, I have access to the product, but what about all the rest? And we needed to build that on the way. So I think in terms of learning and calling out, those countries like Spain, for example, or UK that had plans for how to introduce these innovative products really succeeded. And then the last one is, of course, it's pay for performance scheme. Sorry for that, which of course in a number of countries was possible and others not. And that of course has been incredibly helpful when there is a little bit of risk still, when we don't have long-term follow-up, we don't have placebo-controlled trials, etc.
And I would echo. I think that the countries where we've seen the earliest uptake in CAR-T have actually been those countries who obviously have a reimbursement solution that works for them, that gives them an opportunity to offer access, but also those that have also worked on the delivery platforms, either as hospital groups or as national healthcare systems, in actually establishing delivery. And delivery mechanisms, as we heard, can be different for different types of product. I think one thing also worth calling out, because it may be interesting as we move forward, is I don't know if you include the UK in Europe anymore, and I can claim a Swiss passport as well as the UK passport, so I don't know if that makes me inside or outside of Europe. But one of the interesting things I think most recently has been the UK's adoption of an innovative licensing and access program for very novel products, because I'm hoping that will actually be able to permit discussions of the data that's required for both and satisfying both needs as we go through the system, with all of the limitations that we agree we're going to have at the end, with in respect of short-term follow-up, and not necessarily initially being positioned in the ideal position for where a product will ultimately be used, because most physicians, will intend to use these products more widely eventually. I'm aware that we're running a little bit close to time. So what I'm going to do by way of a last question is really give you an opportunity for each of the panelists to comment on how optimistic they are about the future and how their optimism could be improved if there were certain things that were actually going to be addressed in order to hopefully make that future brighter. So if each of you could perhaps give me an overview of how positive you are about the future in Europe for the advanced cell and gene therapy space, but then also what you think could be most valuable in addressing that future to make it even brighter. I'd appreciate that. So let's maybe do this in a different order. And so I'll go from the other side of the screen, starting maybe with Doug.
Yeah, I think you need to be eternally optimistic in this setting or you go crazy, because everything we do requires you to think differently. So, you run into a number of roadblocks, so you need to be optimistic that you're going to find a way through those roadblocks, whatever they may be. So I'm incredibly optimistic. I think we have partners on the other side, whether talking about pricing, reimbursement, or regulatory, anything else, that also want to get these therapies through and into patients. So I feel people are acting on their best interests. It's just that we got to work through the stuff in the middle. I think what would need to change is this a kind of more centralized way of thinking through things, so it's not so one-off in each country, whether it's a reimbursement discussion or getting supplies across borders or cross-border payment. I think if there was a more centralized way, and granted it's going to take forever to get that done, but the more centralized way of thinking through that makes things a lot easier. And especially if you have therapies that do have these long-term value, take a while, and maybe that price is going to fluctuate as real-world evidence comes out, that's fine. But if there's a way we can centralize that, make it a little bit more straightforward, treat as many patients as we can, capture that evidence, and then see what that means in the real world, I think that would make a lot of sense. So anything about structurally working across the markets to make things work for these type of therapies in particular, because they will be set in different countries and people are going to move around, I think is incredibly important. But overall, like I said, optimistic, because if you're not, this job could get real hard. And so I have a lot of fun every day dealing with stuff.
Thank you. And Dick, you've now moved around my board, but you're actually the next one now on the board. Thanks.
No, I'm equally optimistic as Doug, and what fuels that optimism is, of course, this general optimism that Doug speaks about, but also the experience we have here. Like Doug said, it's been so many hurdles. The systems are really not designed for us to get in here with an innovative, highly efficacious treatment that is a one-off. It goes against anything the system is designed for, and still we were able to get access in quite fast time, and that speaks heaply, I think, about the interest of people to make this happen. We have been able to partner with payers, with regulators, with lawyers, etc., to make this happen. So there's every reason to be positive and look at the future in a bright way. At the same time, of course, I'm a little bit concerned about all those hurdles, right? It's not that the system is working for us. We're making it happen despite the system here. So what happens if you come in with a cell and gene therapy which is innovative but not highly innovative like we did now? Will we have the same experience?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the interesting features is that we're relatively early in cell and gene therapy, but if you listen to the EMEA, and I think that they're right, by the way, they're expecting by 2025 between 10 and 20 cell and gene therapies a year. So clearly it's great that we're at the pioneering forefront of these advances, but we're going to have to find some solutions that work very broadly quite quickly because of just the volume of the challenge that we're going to face in the future. Robin, would you like to go next?
Absolutely, yeah. And let me start by, of course, I'm optimistic as Orchard Therapeutics only has an HSC gene therapy platform. In a way, we have all our eggs in one basket, so we have to make this a success to survive. But I'm optimistic, especially because I see how these therapies can make a difference to patients and the unmet need that we're addressing. And if you do that, you will find a way. And that's a thing I learned in my career in biotech. So. A couple of things that I already mentioned before, the willingness we see to cooperate, and as we commented on, due to the level of innovations that ATMPs have, and coupled with the rarity of the diseases that we treat, only a small number of experts would have the knowledge to assess them. So cross-country collaborations involving those joint health technology assessments may be needed to support broad and timely access, and we see a growing willingness to do that. And then on the point of accessibility, due to the complex nature again of these therapies, and the small number of patients, the treatment centers, by definition will be few. So again, focused on making sure that those cross-border movements work well, cross-border reimbursement issues are worked out, and also there I'm hopeful. We do see a couple of hurdles that we talked about before, but I also see a number of countries where we are able to make this work. And then last but not least, back to my favorite topic of newborn screening and actually finding those patients with those rare genetic diseases. Again, there. Hopefully we can continue to learn from those countries that are much more progressive and aggressive in adapting those newborn screening policies at the national level and adding new diseases to the panel. So yeah, I'm optimistic, Dick.
And Emanuele, if you'd like to comment.
Sure. So I share the optimism in the sense that yes, we have broken down a lot of walls. And occasionally bruised ourselves on the way in and out of those walls over the last 3 years. And so that, by definition, gives hope. I think there's an important responsibility that all of us have to now go back to the scene of the crime, so to speak, pick up the pieces and say, okay, we made it through. How and what do we need to fix so that the next time there isn't just another wall that goes up for anyone else or for us individually as companies. So that's really important, and that I would say is more of a call to arms for all of us to join hands and figure out how to make this better for the future. I think secondly, I'm optimistic from an R&D perspective. When you look across Europe, it's not just about delivering product and therapies to patients. We're now seeing a very healthy ecosystem of innovators coming out in Europe, and that's hopeful for a lot of fields, not just cell and gene therapies. You know, it's a real hats off to a European innovation that drove COVID-19 vaccines globally. So that's important as well, because it means that Europe can start to also feed itself, so to say. And as more funding is allocated to R&D, as it has started to happen, and more of that early academic research sees the light of day in companies that start to bring it forward, that will also make Europe a better engine of innovation in an area where it has lagged historically, and it's slowly starting to catch up. So that's really important. And lastly, I would say beyond the industry consortia that are out there trying to make this better, we are seeing signs from the European Union of wanting to tackle some of these challenges through the cancer plan that they have now, creating forums for innovations and improvements that can hopefully solve a lot of the issues that we all have to deal with.
Thank you. So, thank you. So, you know, I think you know, the consensus, and then tell me if I'm wrong, is that we're very optimistic, and that optimism is founded on a number of things. I think one is there is a real recognition of the importance of this type of therapy to patients and the benefits it can bring. That has in turn actually both raised the challenges of having to do things differently, but it's also raised the willingness to collaborate to find solutions. I think one of the things we all hope for is that we can actually accelerate that process, and that's both to gain more access for the patients that need treatments that are available today, but then as you look to the future, we're all expecting and we're all seeing in our research labs a real wealth of great ideas that are coming to fruition, entering the clinic, and hopefully going to lead to long-term benefits to patients. So, you know, some of that need is the mother of invention type of thinking, I think, is coming to the fore here, where you know, that I very much congratulate the early pioneers in the space, but one of the things that we now need to do is to build on that foundation and move forward. And I think the great thing about Europe has been the willingness to actually to recognize the importance of this type of medicine, and we are now beginning to see solutions being adopted to some of the elements that have been holding back the access, and I hope in future may even accelerate further. I'm aware that we've come to the end of the program now. Obviously, there's going to be an opportunity to address questions in the session afterwards. So if anyone would like to put any questions to each or all of us, please do so. I would like, however, to thank the panelists for their contributions. It's always a pleasure to listen to my colleagues and to share their experiences and gain from their expertise. So I'd like to thank you all very much for your participation in the meeting. We hope that also all of the people who have participated, who have actually joined the meeting, have benefited from it. And we wish you all the best in all your endeavors to make advanced cell and gene therapies available to more patients in Europe. Thanks a lot and goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.